Welcome everyone, good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining this panel on preserving cultural heritage in turbulent times. Thank you all for being here in person, and it's a bit crowded, but I think we are all fine and have a seat, almost all, yes. And also thank you to the participants joining online. Yes, so the National and University Library of Bosnia and Herzegovina was seen as the symbol of the cultural, ethnic, and religious pluralism of Bosnia, according to UNESCO. In the night of the 25th of August in 1992, during the siege, the National and University Library of Bosnia and Herzegovina was shelled by enemy forces and destroyed, including 2 million volumes. The Iraq Museum in Baghdad, Iraq's National Museum, contains highly valuable relics from the Mesopotamian, Abbasid, and Persian times. In April of 2003, during the war, the museum was looted, with thousands of valuable objects being removed within a couple of days. Attacks on cultural heritage sites by ISIS in Iraq and Syria, including the ancient Sikh Palmyra in Syria, are also among the better-known efforts of destruction of cultural heritage sites during conflict. And more recently, also during the ongoing war in Israel-Palestine, there were reports of the bombing of the central archives building of the municipality of Gaza, resulting in the destruction of documents dating back 100 years. These are just a few of innumerous examples of destruction of cultural heritage in times of war and how such sites have been attacked. Libraries, museums, archives, historical and archaeological sites, and many others. All these are sites of cultural heritage. They help preserve the national and local traditions, the memory. They are tangible expressions of cultures, and oftentimes are linked to the intangible expressions of one's culture. They preserve culture, and they can also become an important tool in sharing mutual memory, shared by all of us, by a society as a whole. In turbulent times, such as conflict, tangible and with this also intangible expressions of culture are often under attack by enemy forces, as the examples in the very beginning have shown. They are protected by various instruments of international humanitarian law and also international human rights law. It is also important to mention the protection of these cultural heritage sites is always centered also around the protection of the professionals working in these sites. So why is preservation of cultural heritage in turbulent times so important? Because it's deeply linked to one's society's identity. Additionally, looking at it from the perspective of rebuilding a society after conflict, cultural property can also be a symbol for an accepted, difficult past and can also be a driver for reconciliation. Of course, cultural heritage also, to a certain degree, determines what society wants to remember and what is not remembered or what is obscured. You see where I'm going. Cultural heritage is deeply connected to a society's identity and to collective memory. Human rights archives specifically are also cultural heritage. And the memory of difficult times should be preserved to remember not only the victims, but also the conflict and also prevent recurrence. We are here at the Basel Peace Forum, and this year's Basel Peace Forum is under the subject of navigating narratives. This panel, not by coincidence, is also very closely linked to this. What is preserved and what is not preserved is very strongly linked to the existing of certain narratives and also has direct impacts on these narratives. It is shaping the narrative. But how can cultural heritage sites be preserved during times of conflict or disaster? How are actors working together to increase its protection? And what are the risks and challenges when it comes to this field? Why is it so crucial? To answer all these questions, I'm very happy that I'm not here alone, but that I'm joined by an excellent panel of 3 people here on site with me, and also one of them joining online from Canada. Thank you to all 4 of you for being here. Maybe I can start with quickly introducing the 4. So joining online from Canada is our keynote speaker, Hadi Marifat. Hadi is co-founder and director of the Afghanistan Human Rights and Democracy Organization, and he is an Afghan human rights activist and has worked as a country analyst with the Center for Civilians in Conflict, Human Rights Watch, and also the United Nations Assistance Mission in Afghanistan, UNAMA. He has a background in international relations and peace and conflict studies. Hadi will be speaking on preserving cultural heritage and memory in the context of Afghanistan in a keynote speech. I'm really looking forward to it, Hadi. Before that, let me introduce also the other panel members. So Hadi was not able to travel to Basel, but we are very fortunate to have Sophia Milosevich-Biefeld with us today here in Basel. She's currently leading the Memorialization and Transitional Justice Program at AHRDO, so the Afghanistan Human Rights and Democracy Organization. And she previously was the Global Networks Program Director in the International Coalition Sites of Conscience, has substantial experience working on cultural heritage and transitional justice, and has worked with organizations across Switzerland, Afghanistan, Rwanda, and Kenya. She has a background in political science and focuses her research around the dynamics of memory in post-conflict contexts, and also published in this area. Thank you so much for being here, Sophia. Discussing on the panel with Sophia is also Peter Stone on my far right. Peter is the president of the Blue Shield International since 2020, an international NGO created to advise UNESCO on protecting cultural heritage in the event of armed conflict. Peter also holds the UNESCO Chair in Cultural Property Protection and Peace. He served as the chair of the International Committee of the Blue Shield and was the head of the School of Arts and Culture and professor of heritage studies at the International Center for Cultural and Heritage Studies at Newcastle. Also, thank you, Peter, very much for joining this panel today. Then discussing with the 2 of them is Tania Esposito, who is the deputy head of the specialized body for the international transfer of cultural property at the Swiss Federal Office of Culture within the Federal Department of Home Affairs. She has a lot of experience in the field of cultural property law. Her work has especially focused on the protection of cultural heritage in the context of illicit trafficking of cultural property. She also has rich experience when it comes to the return and restitution of cultural property to the countries of origin in the context of looting and illicit trafficking. She has worked in the field of criminal public prosecution and as a barrister, as a degree in arts management. Thank you, Tania, for joining us this afternoon. Yes, we are very fortunate to have 4 of them on this in this event, Hadi as a keynote speaker, and afterwards discussing with the 3 of you. We are really looking forward to it all. And with this, I would like to hand over to you, Hadi, for your keynote speech.
Thank you, Esther. Good afternoon and good morning to those of you joining from other time zone. And thank you so much for having me. It is indeed a great honor to share this panel with such a distinguished panelist, and I look forward to the discussion. In the aftermath of World War I and the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire, Afghanistan found itself swept up in the wave of nationalism and pan-Islamic fervor that gripped the Asian continent. Breaking free from British imperial control in 1919, Afghan political leaders faced the formidable challenge of unifying a diverse population while asserting their newly gained independence against British influence. In this quest, cultural heritage, archaeology, and museums emerged as a potent tool to promote political agendas. State museums in Afghanistan have traditionally celebrated a national identity centered on the notions that the country's identity emerged with the rise of Pashtun rulers in the 18th and 19th century. This perspective, however, significantly overlooks Afghanistan's rich cultural, intellectual and political history that transcends local and regional boundaries, and thus curtailing the establishment of a trans-ethnic and inclusive cultural or national identity. The 1920s marked a pivotal moment when Afghan leaders, recognizing the potential of cultural heritage, sought collaboration with foreign cultural heritage actors such as archaeologists. Diplomatic cultural agreements were inked with nations such as France, followed by a strategic alliance with India, Italy, Japan, and the United States from the 1950s onwards. This collaboration not only laid the foundation for Afghanistan's archaeological discipline, but also transformed archaeological sites and collections into powerful national symbols. The National Museum of Afghanistan in Kabul, repository of the country's archaeological treasures, became a sanctuary for preserving national pride and asserting territorial boundaries against foreign influence. Throughout the 20th century, political leaders embraced the National Museum, a symbol of the Afghan nation. State-sponsored initiatives disseminated this narrative to national and international audiences, solidifying the role of cultural heritage in shaping and communicating the national identity of Afghanistan. However, this national identity construction led by the Pashtun government centered around the cultural and practices of the dominant group, the Pashtuns. Pashtun rulers sought to erase ethnic and regional names, symbols, and boundaries, thereby diminishing local diverse identities and portraying the Pashtun identity as the singular national identity. After the Soviet invasion, political instability, and the civil war, Afghanistan cultural heritage lay in tatters. The looted and emptied National Museum of Afghanistan in Kabul displayed a banner on which the visitor could read, "A nation can stay alive when its culture and history stay alive." Like in so many other conflicts, Afghanistan rich cultural heritage became, with the Afghan civilians, one of the victims of the different cycles of violence that have rocked the country. Looted museums, ravaged archaeological sites, burned archives and libraries, or the two statues of the Buddhas of Bamiyan attached with dynamite and anti-craft missiles have challenged the idea of an Afghan nation. Following the decline of the Pashtun dominance after the civil war and the fall of the Taliban regime in 2001, two trends emerged in Afghanistan. The first sought to revive and promote local identities, while the second aimed to foster functional identities, both as a reaction to historical identity building projects. Some local museums have begun promoting functional identities and narratives. Simultaneously, efforts have been underway to rename public spaces, roads, and roundabouts after key figures known for their roles in the jihad and for advocating local community and identity upliftment. In the post-9/11 state and nation building process, Afghanistan saw therefore the creation of monuments and museums dedicated to ethnic jihadi leaders, many of them accused of war crimes. This therefore imprinted a sense of impunity in the physical landscape of Afghanistan, creating an architecture of impunity for all to see. Victims of war in Afghanistan have long been marginalized in the nation's memorialization effort. The history of the country, both past and present, is marked by systematic killing of civilian and widespread destruction of civilian properties, representing the most salient and devastating aspects of the conflicts in Afghanistan. The Afghanistan Human Rights and Democracy Organization emerged as a critical response to this one-sided understanding of the past, to address impunity and to create a victim-centered architecture of remembrance. In 2011, we launched a memorialization project to revive and document the memories of the Afghan war victims. The concept of memorialization was brought to life through the physical construction of memory boxes. The survivors, example, family members and relatives of the war victims constructed boxes with the technical assistance of AHRDO, collected the personal objects and belongings of their loved ones, and stored them in memory boxes, a kind of a small museum or memorial dedicated to war victims. In the course of the past 1 decade, AHRDO, both through the Memory Box project as well as through other art-based initiatives, has collected about 15,000 personal belongings, objects, and items of war of victims, including confidential and classified documents. Collected and compiled thousands of stories of war victims, memories of life, and compiled a list of war victims with their personal details and photograph, and identified and established a list of 170 mass graves sites, including the collection of a significant number of documents and detailed information about 19 of these mass grave sites. And of course, this is what I'm mentioning is just the tip of the iceberg, because Afghanistan has lost over 20 million civilians before 2001, and that's the estimate that has put by the Afghan government. And of course, the Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission estimated about 1.5 million victims of war. And of course, since 2009, that the UN started to map, over 100,000 civilians lost their lives to the vicious cycle of the conflict in Afghanistan. As a response to the monolithic museum landscape and lack of information of Afghanistan's recent and turbulent past, we, in 2019, established the Afghanistan Center for Memory and Dialogue in Kabul, which housed the collected memories of the Afghan war victims, including the memory boxes. Through this center, we aim to preserve and honor the memories of Afghan war victims and promote a policy of remembrance among the Afghan public, as well as to open spaces for dialogue among Afghan about the root causes of war and the construction of a durable peace. AHRDO and its affiliated memory center were closed after the takeover of Afghanistan by Taliban in August 2021. Today, we human rights defenders and cultural activists have to work from exile with all the challenges that come with it. Last year in December, we launched the Afghanistan Memory Home, the first victim-centered virtual museum and a searchable database dedicated to Afghanistan's war victims and survivors. It is important to highlight that the Memory Home represents the continuation of the work that we have done in establishing the museum in Kabul and aims to fight the amnesia and impunity. The aim of this digital platform remains the same as its predecessor, preserving memories of the Afghan war victims and promoting understanding and dialogue on the root causes of conflict in Afghanistan. Moreover, in the absence of domestic accountability, we are gathering information about specific incidents to support international investigative and accountability process to break the cycle of impunity in Afghanistan. We advocate for justice and demand accountability for perpetrators such as Mullah Abdullah Sarhadi, who was involved in the destruction of the 2 statues of Buddha in Bamiyan in March 2001, and the massacres of innocent Hazara civilians in Yakolan district of Bamiyan in the same year. Sarhadi returned as a governor of Bamiyan in 2021 under the Taliban regime. The broken Buddha statues in Bamiyan remain a witness to his crimes, so the mass graves in Yakolan district of Bamiyan. Afghanistan's landscape has borne witness to cycle of violent conflict. It has seen the reconfiguration and destructions of buildings, museums, monuments, sites, and artifacts at the hand of different political actors, seeking to cement their narrative of past, present, and future. To address social and cultural recovery, we seek to play a small yet important role in preserving Afghanistan's history, memory, culture, to rememorialization and remembering. As for narratives of the war, we have chosen to put the voices and the stories of the victim at the center of remembrance landscape. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Hadi, for this keynote speech and for sharing your insights. We are very impressed by your work of fostering remembrance and working on the preservation of memory in Afghanistan. Thank you very much. Hadi will be staying online, so if there are questions directly to him, they can be asked during the round of questions following the panel discussion. Speak to you soon, Hadi, and thank you again for your keynote speech. Now I would like to continue with our panel discussion here in the room. And so we will have 3 rounds, questions that I will ask to each of you panelists. The first round of question I would like to ask is about your work specifically. So, Sophia, you also work in AHRDO, Hadi, which we have just heard. My first question focuses on your work and specifically on your initiatives that you do to support the preservation of cultural heritage. How is AHRDO's work contributing to this in the turbulent times in Afghanistan?
Thank you. So to pick up on what Hadi was saying before, in Afghanistan, cultural heritage has been a highly politicized topic, if you will, and it has really been used as a site of contestation. This is really, I mean, we mentioned the Buddhas of Bamiyan, and I think it's really, it illustrates this highly politicized nature of cultural heritage, where the destruction of the Buddhas were also seen as an attack on a Hazara minority representation in Afghanistan by the Taliban. So really attacking a symbol behind cultural heritage. So AHRDO's work has really tried to take into account social and symbolic nature of both tangible but also intangible heritage, and working with on memory as a tool for social recovery. Hadi mentioned this new platform, so we've used a lot of art-based approaches to dealing with the past, to address memory issue, memorialization, and questions of peace building and national identity, constructions of national identity to understand root causes of conflict in Afghanistan. And so that we were able to do on the ground in Afghanistan. But since having to move away and sort of hide our work over there, we have now developed an online platform that continues the work that was done in Afghanistan. And this is an online museum, as well as a memorial dedicated to the war victims and dedicated to discuss the different cycles of conflict and the recent history of Afghanistan. It's important to understand in Afghanistan, there is a national museum, but it only talks about very ancient history, and the whole recent history is not at all talked about. And so both the center that was developed in Kabul was aiming at discussing this more recent past, as well as this now online platform that serves as a museum, as a memorial, and also as a searchable database. I mentioned the archives that we also consider as, in a way, as a form of intangible cultural heritage. And this is really something that is important to us and to our work. Behind archives and behind these individual stories, there's also the possibility of seeking accountability and a quest for justice. So that's sort of deep into the work that AHRDO is doing. Sharing numbers are numbers, but when behind these numbers, you can share individual stories of victims, of their families, and the impact of war. That is what is really for us important. So addressing the past and in also combating this erasure of memory is for us key to our work.
Yes, thank you for sharing more on the context of Afghanistan. We will come back to this. Maybe Tania, can you also tell us more about the Federal Office on Culture in the field of preservation of culture?
Thank you so much. So maybe just to start with a little overview, just to tell you that on the federal level, like kind of who is doing what, because the Federal Office of Culture is the Federal Department of the Interior. So it is not very intuitively, you would think that Federal Office of Culture is doing work that sort of affects cultural property of other states or the protection, especially in times of crisis. So maybe just as a little overview, on the federal level, so if you really talk specifically about the protection of cultural property, like from armed conflicts and natural disasters, this work is basically or mainly based on the implementation of the Hague Convention for the protection of cultural property in the event of armed conflicts of 1954. And this work is actually ensured at the federal level at the Federal Office for Civil Protection, which belongs to the Federal Department of Defense, Civil Protection and Sports. So it is not in our department, so I cannot really talk about them. But why I mention it is because there is one very specific and interesting tool that construct that Switzerland is actually offering in context of the protection of cultural property of other or cultural heritage of other states, which is called the Safe Haven. And this is Safe Haven. I just mention it so that it is said because it belongs in this context. And the Safe Haven is actually an offer of Switzerland that is on the table for states on request to bring their cultural heritage or the cultural properties that are most important out of the country because they are so much at risk. So they have a safe haven, and then they can be deposited in specific facilities to be out of harm for the moment being, and then to go back to the country. So this is just what I want to mention, but this is not in the work of the Federal Office of Culture. So what we do specifically in regard to the protection of cultural heritage in general and other states is actually the work that we do. We are mandated with the protection of movable cultural property against illicit trafficking and the promotion of the preservation of movable cultural heritage based on the 1970 UNESCO Convention. Excuse me for this long title. It's the Convention on the Means of Prohibiting and Preventing the Illicit Import, Export and Transfer of Ownership of Cultural Property. This convention is not specifically targeted to moments, times of crisis and wars, but it has rather a broader goal. It speaks generally about the importance of protecting and preserving movable cultural heritage when it is threatened by loss, theft, looting, illicit trafficking. But of course, as we heard, I mean, it is always when there is a conflict, armed conflict, wars, etc. Of course, this topic, like the cultural property, is always at risk. So this is where, like, our work sort of comes close to the topic of cultural property in crisis. Esther mentioned the Museum of Baghdad. I already had it on my list for a good example, but this is exactly what we are talking about. So maybe just to get a bit more specific, so what actually do we do in regard of the cultural heritage of other countries? So what we do is, for instance, we negotiate bilateral agreements on the import and return of cultural property with other states, and usually these are like, we call them source countries, like countries that have especially rich in cultural property. So for Switzerland has 9 such agreements with other countries. Among them, it's like Turkey, Cyprus, Italy, Mexico, Egypt, China, etc. It's not all of them. So it's 9 all in all. Another activity that we do is that we can support projects with financial assistance for the preservation of cultural heritage in other states. We also carry out restitutions of cultural property that has been stolen or looted from their countries of origin. And we also engage in the prevention against the illicit trafficking of cultural property. So for a concrete example that I was being asked to show you, I would like maybe mention our activities we are doing in the context of the war in the Ukraine. So actually, one of the really first things we did, like really like days or maybe 1 week after the war started, it was actually really on an operational level, because we were contacting customs officials, because when we have a crisis like this, like sooner or later, when as we said, as collateral damage of crisis and wars, you have the looting and the theft of cultural property. Sooner or later, they will circulate, and so we really, this is what we do. Like we create risk profiles of especially of cultural property that's especially at risk, because we don't want, of course, that stolen or looted cultural property ends up in Switzerland. So this is one actually what we did. Also, we were sort of raising, like did some awareness raising with the art trade, and also with transport companies or art logistics companies. Secondly, we had, I was talking about the supporting of projects. And so the director of the Federal Office of Culture decided that we would make a special call for projects that would benefit the preservation or the protection of Ukrainian cultural heritage. And so we supported, I think it's around 14 projects all in all that would go to the protection of the Ukrainian cultural heritage. And the kind of projects, there were a lot of them were actually just very basic projects. In the end, it was the acquisition and transport of protective material to museums in the Ukraine. So that was actually, this would be transport of fire extinguisher, bubble wrap, like really this basic material that very quickly was not available anymore. So the museum, they needed to wrap up everything and store it somewhere safe. Another part of the project that we funded had a focus on building up inventories, digitize archives. So I was just mentioning that this one kind of project in regard to the protection of Ukrainian cultural properties or cultural heritage was projects that focus on building up inventories and archives, because as we already heard, I mean, this is something that is so important. Also, like if maybe the object will get destroyed, you would at least have it somewhere in your archive. So we also like fund the technical equipment to do this, like 3D scanners. And then there was a third kind of project in this context, and that was actually, there were projects of exhibitions in Switzerland of Ukrainian artworks from museum in the Ukraine, and so it was kind of, it had maybe a kind of a triple goal. It was on one way, it was actually showing Ukrainian art, like it was very important art pieces in an exhibition. And what was also actually one of these exhibitions here in Basel at the museum. And there were also, which was very nice to see, that there was a lot of Ukrainian citizens, people who were in exile or fled from the war, who would go to this exhibition also in a way to connect. And thirdly, of course, there is a means of bring the artworks out of harm's way. So it was a kind of a safe haven in a different form. Because also maybe in the context of the safe haven, or this is always also a very political decision, of course, for a country. Like if you want to, in what way do you want to evacuate your cultural heritage, especially when at the core maybe of a conflict or of a war, there is really the cultural identity. So it is really, so it was maybe in a small way, it was a kind of a safe haven, but under the pretext maybe of an exhibition. So this was kind of the works or the projects that we could do, and we are still continuing. So maybe
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Tania, for explaining us more about your work and also the specific case of how you contributed or how Switzerland contributed to protection of cultural heritage in Ukraine. With this, I want to ask the same question to Peter Stone. How is the Blue Shield International contributing to protecting cultural heritage in times of conflict?
Okay, thank you. If you don't mind, I'm going to stand up, please, to ease my legs, but also to see you. It comes from about 100 years ago being a teacher at a school, and if I couldn't see what was going on, I knew something was going bad. I was introduced as both a UNESCO chair in cultural property protection and peace, the only such designation in the world, but also as the president of the Blue Shield. I do not speak for UNESCO, I do not work for UNESCO, and I am not paid by UNESCO. The best example of what UNESCO chairs are is critical friends. And on occasion, it has been pointed out to me by colleagues in UNESCO that I get a little too critical. So let's leave the UNESCO hat to one side. I can talk because I'm the elected president of the organisation, the Blue Shield. Could we have the first slide? The Blue Shield on the left of that screen is the emblem of the 1954 Hague Convention, and you've heard the full title of that, but it talks about the Hague Convention on the protection of cultural property in the event of armed conflict. And so the Blue Shield tends to use that legal term, cultural property, but we expand our understanding of cultural property away from just the tangible, as in Article 1 of the 54 Convention, but to cultural and natural, tangible and intangible, to bring in the whole aspect, and also, as I say, natural, on the basis that probably more than half of the world don't accept that distinction. The emblem on the right of the screen is the logo of my organisation. So the emblem of the convention is the only other emblem that has the same protection in international law as the Red Cross, the Red Crescent, the Red Crystal. Ours has that in the middle, but to distinguish from the legal protection, we have the Blue Shield circle around it. So those are the logos, that's what I'm talking about, the Blue Shield. But let's just go back to basics for a minute. Cultural property, cultural heritage, defines and gives people a sense of place, a sense of identity, a sense of belonging, a sense of dignity. It contributes to their well-being. It can be used post-conflict for post-conflict stabilisation through economic means, through social means, and through tourism. It can build in Blue Shield language healthy, peaceful, stable, secure, sustainable communities. And those communities are the bedrock of social peace. And that's what the Blue Shield is specifically about, building those. But of course, it can also be used as a reason for going to war, as a weapon in war, as a target in war. So cultural property is a very two-edged sword, let's call it. And the protection of cultural property is therefore an important aspect of conflict from both sides, both for protection, but also positive aspects of protection and negative aspects. And that's being talked about for the last 2,500 years since Sun Shao in 6th century BC China first raised some of these issues. And these ideas were well understood by those colleagues who at the end of the Second World War, and nearly all of them had lived through both world wars, sat down to begin to draft the 1954 Hague Convention. But on one of the series of meetings that was held in 1953, in fact, the Director General of UNESCO stood up and said, "Gentlemen," and of course at that stage they all were gentlemen in the room, "Gentlemen, I want to remind you that we are not here only to draft a new convention, but to call, in my words, his words, the Red Cross for cultural property. And over the next 3 months or so, that Red Cross for Cultural Property became known for obvious reasons as the Blue and White Shield. And that was just came from the Googling of a Polish professor on his notes. And when somebody said, we need an emblem for this, he said, what about this? And there we are. And that also came from a whole structure of thinking that I would be extremely short about, but came from an individual Polish Jewish lawyer, Raphael Lemkin, who had been looking at attacks on populations and minorities. In particular, he got the interest in this from the attacks on the Armenians in the First World War. And Lemkin actually defined a new word, created a new word by putting two bits of Latin and Greek together, genocide. And he was the person who drafted the Genocide Convention of 1948. But in the early drafts of that convention, Lemkin had two versions of genocide. In Chapter 2, he had barbarism, genocide against the people. Chapter 3, he had vandalism, genocide against those people's cultural property. And the distinction he would not make. They happened to be in two different chapters, but they were indivisibly intertwined. And that's the argument that Blue Shield still has today, that yes, in conflict, always put people first in protecting them immediately. However, the protection of people and the protection of their cultural property, their cultural heritage, are indivisibly intertwined, because in the medium and long term, those people need their cultural property to re-establish those communities at the end of the conflict and to reconnect with each other. And if you want just one example of a negative example of that relationship, go to the village of Brocko in former Yugoslavia. And in the fighting there, the population were rounded up and taken about a mile away from the village and lined up against the side of a large trench which had just been dug, and were machine gunned into the trench. But the trench was not filled up with the earth that had come out to make the trench. Instead, it was filled up with the remains and the rubble from that community's mosque, which had been completely destroyed, and as an archaeologist, I would say taken down to natural, so that there was no evidence at all for a future archaeologist to say, yes, here's a ground plan of a mosque. And the two, the people and their cultural property, buried in the same grave. They are absolutely indivisible. I've been, so the idea was to create the Blue and White Shield in 1954. Sadly, that never happened. The organisation was created eventually in 1999 by 4 international heritage organisations. And I'll come back to that in my next opportunity. My one example that I've been asked to do, and then I'll sit down and shut up. One example, in the prelude to the NATO-led armed fighting in Libya in 2011, the US National Committee of the Blue Shield helped develop a no-strike list of cultural sites that we, and with help from others, asked NATO not to damage, if at all possible, in their military activities. And there is a clause in the Hague Convention of military necessity. So that just the get out clause. But we gave them the list. A NATO targeteer sitting on an airfield in the Netherlands identified 6 vehicles of a mobile communications unit of troops loyal to President Gaddafi, and they were put on a target list for the next few days. And the weapon allocated to that was one big weapon which would destroy all 6 at the same time, because they were inside and around a derelict building. And that was great. And what was even better was, and I don't know the detail of this, but the equivalent of a red light flashed on his or her computer because the coordinates for their derelict building were the coordinates for a Roman building that we had given them. And from satellite imagery, it was perfectly reasonable for them to identify that as a derelict building, a building with walls but no roof, etc. So the decision went up the food chain, but it was then taken that instead of using one large bomb to destroy all 6, including the Roman building, 6 precision weapons were used, making the operation more than 6 times as expensive, but protecting the Roman building, and all of those 6 vehicles were destroyed. NATO got something that they were extraordinarily unused to getting, which was a lot of good publicity. They got so much good publicity that they set up an internal inquiry as to what they'd done right and how could they do this in the future. And that reported in December 2012, and its primary recommendation was to have a NATO-wide cultural property protection policy. Now, that was 2012, we're now in 2024. We haven't quite got there yet, but Blue Shield is advising NATO on the content of that policy, and we aspire to have it done this year in Washington at the NATO summit. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter, also for mentioning this very specific example of good publicity. Thank you. So we heard about several initiatives from our 3 panelists. I also want to make mention just very briefly of one initiative that we as swisspeace have been supporting in the past couple of years, and this is the Safe Havens for Archives at Risk initiative. Tania has also been mentioning Safe Havens for Cultural Property. This is not related. I'm speaking specifically on the Safe Havens for Archives at Risk initiative, which builds on the fact that archives containing human rights violations or breaches of international humanitarian law are oftentimes at risk also in times of conflict for destruction. This is specifically for archives also which are important for peace building or for rebuilding a society. So swisspeace has been working as the secretariat of this initiative also, which is related to the protection of cultural heritage and these archives at risk. And we have been working with the advisory committee and also different sending institutions, so mostly NGO archives, but also others, and then hosting institutions abroad which can host archives at risk from contexts of where they are put at risk. So I have been, this is just also to mention, this work has been supported by the Swiss FDHA. So we have been working together with many different actors, as I have been saying, on this initiative. And I am sure also 3 of you have been coordinating with many different actors in your initiatives. And this is the direction where my next question will go. So yes, maybe I can start with Tania this time. Tania, you have been already a bit mentioning bilateral agreements and how you work with different actors, but can you specify a bit more who is involved? How do you work jointly, maybe also with local organizations, or how is the collaboration going?
Okay, so like as a federal office, of course, so we work like on a more strategic level, like in this context of the protection of cultural property. So we work on a multilateral level, which is like at UNESCO. So this is UNESCO is of course an important partner where we have where we see and connect with our other partners and member states. Of course, this is always in accordance with Federal Department of Foreign Affairs because it also affects them. Then on bilateral levels, we work with other governments in regard to the negotiation of these bilateral agreements of the import and return of cultural property, and also on the cooperation. So this is really, so we work with our partner partner institutions, like this is usually like the Ministry of Cultures from the other countries. But then you also talk about like concrete activities like this project that I was mentioning. So there are the range of actors or that we are working with is very wide. I mean, this could be state actors, but it also could be an NGO or it could be universities. So it is really there we work with very different people. So what we do not do, especially in context of projects, it is not, we do not work on the ground like in the other countries. So if there is projects, we will not go. It's not us who go there because we basically the main work is that we fund and support the projects, but it is projects of third parties. So it's not us effectively then going on the ground. So maybe this is yeah.
Okay. Yes, thank you for sharing. Peter, I want to ask you the same question.
I'm going to stand up again. So the Blue Shield is all about collaboration. Heritage people cannot protect cultural property on their own during conflict. In fact, as Ukrainian colleagues will say, it is almost impossible to start to protect cultural property once the conflict has already started. CPP, cultural property protection, is a peacetime activity. It has to be a multi-sector, cross-government initiative, including civil society. No one is going to deliver this on its own. And we envisage Blue Shield as a triangle within a circle. And if you allow me, the triangle has, as all good triangles have, 3 points. A heritage sector, the humanitarian sector, and what we refer to as the uniform sector, so the armed forces, but border and customs, police, other emergency services. And as put to me by a senior American military officer a couple of years ago now, oh, I get it, sir. The space within the triangle is where there are no stupid questions. And he got it in one. Absolutely right. Because even though those 3 sectors start from completely different points, they all have a very similar end goal. In Blue Shield language, the creation of those healthy, peaceful, stable, sustainable, secure communities. Okay, but what they have to do and negotiate within the triangle is how they are going to do that in the broader context of any particular conflict, which is encapsulated in the circle. And there you've got the political context. Is cultural property going to be a reason for the conflict? Has it been a reason for the conflict? Is it going to be a tool or a weapon in the conflict? The legal context, who's ratified what bit of international law, etc. And then increasingly important, and I'll come back to this in my third stance, the media context, and the media context increasingly important in all of this activity. We work, so that's sort of international coordination. Internally, Blue Shield works. We now have 30 or more than 30 national committees with another 12, I think it is, under preparation. And we hope to be having a meeting in June where there are a group of, I think it is now 7 Eastern European countries who have had their focus on protection of cultural property enhanced for obvious reasons. And they are all trying to set up Blue Shield national committees, and we're trying to bring them together with existing national committees from around the world so that they can learn from those. But we have created, both for Blue Shield International and for the national committees, a common framework. So we ask everybody to plan to and report on an annual basis 6 areas of activity. So legal action, proactive protection, training, education, emergency response are some of those. And we ask the national committees to order them as national priorities in whichever way they want to. And because most of the national committees are almost entirely voluntary, they don't have to do all 6. They can just say, we're focusing on these 2 this year, and that's fine. But it gives a cohesion and a similarity across the whole of the organisation. We also work to the same 8 threats to cultural property in armed conflict. So lack of planning, lack of military or humanitarian awareness, specific targeting, collateral damage, etc. And we have externally developed over the last few years, since 2017, formal relations with a whole group of organisations. For example, 2 from the UN peacekeeping force in Lebanon, UNIFIL, the UN training school in Ireland, UNTSI, NATO, the Smithsonian Centre for Emergency Response, and in progress UNESCO. And we're trying to build that collaboration and that networking, awareness raising, education training in almost every continent in the world. But we are scratching the surface, and this will come in the last bit, because we're too small an organisation.
Hearing more on the collaboration from Blue Shield perspective. Back to you, Sophia, and the context in Afghanistan. You have been mentioning how cultural heritage has been also to shape narratives, how you have to use from physical to a virtual memory. Who are you collaborating with? Maybe also, how are you collaborating still after the Taliban takeover with people on the ground without putting them at risk? And tell us more about it.
Yes, thank you. So, I mean, for us, we very much see our work as a ground up and very victim-centered. So despite the great risk, we continue to do documentation inside the country and investigations. And in a way, of course, with the capture of Kabul by the Taliban and the great number of forced displacement of people outside, we have also now access to a lot of victims that maybe would be more difficult to access when they were in Afghanistan. So we are now also very much in contact with victims outside of Afghanistan. Previously, we worked, as I was saying, very much close to the ground with Victims Association in Afghanistan, leading to a convention of victims there. And we are planning to do a similar convention now with victims that are in exile. But we, of course, collaborate with other organizations, swisspeace, for example, but we have also the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience, where we collaborate with other memorialization and transitional justice organizations around the world to promote South-South learning and sharing experiences. Of course, countries like Colombia have a wealth of experience, unfortunately, a wealth of experience in terms of transitional justice work, accountability, reparation work, archives. And so we work with these different organizations to sort of inspire us, because we are working in very difficult circumstances. In Afghanistan, previously, there was no possibility to action any accountability mechanism inside Afghanistan, because there was an amnesty law that pardoned all past and future crimes. And so again, there's maybe a silver lining now that we are outside of Afghanistan, and so many victims / also perpetrators outside of Afghanistan, to mobilize maybe the universal jurisdiction to seek accountability for these victims. So yes, we work with locally, internationally.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for all 3 of you on sharing about the coordination. Now, I think we already heard a bit about many challenges which come with this type of work. So I would like to open a short 3rd round so that we have time for questions after. But Peter, can you tell us about your main challenges?
Okay, main challenges. Firstly, there is a perceived, and I think it's probably true, increase in the use of heritage as a reason for going to war and a target and a weapon in war. There is still a residual lack of buy-in from the humanitarian sector and the uniform sector, and to some extent the heritage sector, who there's a residual group there who refused to work with the uniform sector. There is a lack of political understanding about the importance of cultural property, and if I can, I will just give you quickly one really negative example of that. So in 2002, prior to the invasion of Iraq in 2003, there were 6 so-called think tanks established in Washington. One of those apparently had a subcommittee on culture, the whole of culture, which reputedly never met. As a result, there was no political incentive for the protection of any cultural property in Iraq. As a result, there was no military incentive for protection, and therefore no military units were, as they were for protecting the main bank or the Ministry of Energy or whatever, nobody was given a task to protect the National Museum or the National Archive, etc. As a result, nobody did it because soldiers don't do it unless they're ordered to do it. As a result, all of them were looted. And just as an example of how this percolates down, when my now sadly late colleague Donnie George, then the director of research at the National Museum, went to the American army and said, please come and protect the National Museum. It is just about to be looted. They stopped short of arresting him, but kept him there for a number of hours, because when they checked on their maps, there was no National Museum on the map. And so they thought he was an insurgent trying to lure them into an ambush. So nothing. As a result, all of the national institutions, libraries everywhere, hundreds of archaeological sites, if not thousands, looted. It gets worse though, because nothing is still not protected as late as 2006. The attack and destruction of the Al-Aqshiri Mosque in Samarra is seen as by many commentators as the tipping point from an increasingly belligerent Iraqi society into the full-scale sectarian civil war. A civil war that under Western political eyes meant that the coalition troops had to stay in Iraq for a further 5 years. 5 years worth of taking casualties and fatalities, but more importantly, I think, 5 years of losing the propaganda war and the media war. And that provided the space for the re-emergence of Al-Qaeda in Iraq and the oxygen for the emergence of the so-called Islamic State. Neither of those are going to go away in the next 50 years. They are going to be world problems for at least 50 years. I'm not going to necessarily make a claim that there is a full, direct and simple relationship, but there is certainly a level of relationship between the failure to protect cultural property and the implications of that space. Everybody needs training in cultural property protection. We're working in Ukraine at the moment, trying to train the Ukrainian armed forces, trying to establish a Blue Shield National Committee, trying to train prosecutors and judges about how to deal with such issues. And we're looking, this year is the 70th anniversary of the 54 Convention. We're looking to the future as to what are going to be the challenges into the future. And just 3 examples. How is AI going to affect it? How does cyber attack affect things? And just one tiny quick example of that. A cyber specialist said, okay, I can go into this museum and I can change all of the labels on everything in your collection from belonging to this country to belonging to this country. And I can do that in about half an hour. Okay. And then climate change. What are the implications of that? We heard some of that in the fascinating session this morning. So that's looking to the future. The biggest problem funding the Blue Shield is funding. I don't know if I said that twice in that sentence, but anyway, The biggest problem facing the Blue Shield is funding, or rather lack of it. At the moment, it is predicated on the core funding for a central team being provided by Newcastle University in the UK. That is definitely going to stop in 4 years' time. It may well stop at the end of this year. Because this is the 70th anniversary of the Hague Convention, we are in the process of the first steps of a major fundraising campaign to fund the central office. We can get project funding for the work we do relatively easily, but nobody will fund the core team that is needed to get that project funding, coordinate that funding, etc., etc. That's the biggest problem, because if people like what the Blue Shield does, and there's an awful lot more about what the Blue Shield does on our website, then if somebody doesn't step up fairly quickly, there isn't going to be a Blue Shield, and it will be back to relying on a part-time administrator in one of the founding 4 NGOs, just organising an annual meeting.
There are quite some challenges that you are facing, and also that I think we are facing in your space and outlook. Sophia, back to you. What are the challenges that, what are the main challenges that you see in your work with AHRDO?
So it's quite moving to hear all these examples in Libya, in Iraq, because Afghanistan has gone through all these stages of destruction, of violence, of looting, of erasing of the past, right? When you loot an archaeological dig, it's not just a few objects that you steal, but it's the possibility for a country, for people to reconstruct its own history and to reconstruct its own past. So these challenges for social recovery are really very big. Also, I think it's important to mention also the use of cultural heritage and the looting to fund extremist groups and the Taliban or ISKP in Afghanistan. So that's also, I think, something to mention. And Peter talked about Lemkin, talked about genocide. And maybe also we need to mention the first case that was taken up by the ICC, right, of the destruction of the Al-Mahdi tomb in Timbuktu as the first, the destruction of cultural heritage as the first war, first time it was recognized as a war crime. So for us who are trying to work around accountability, for us it starts with documentation on the ground, archives, accessing these archives, be it in Afghanistan, be it elsewhere, because these are important for truth-telling. And why are they important? It's also for accountability down the line. I think, those are our challenges: access to the ground, access to accountability mechanisms outside.
Thank you, Sophia. Tania?
So thank you, Esther. So maybe from the Swiss point of view, or like from this Federal Office of Culture, and speaking for a country that is not it's not a source country, but it is the import country, and a country with a very important art trade and very strong art trade with many museums and many collectors. So really one of a big challenge actually that we are always working on is actually the challenge of the awareness rising of the public of the importance to really protect cultural heritage and its fundamental role in the society. So that we can understand that it is relevant for us, that if it is happening, that all over the world, like archaeological sites are being looted. So, and this is many times people are not aware of this, or they think, oh yeah, this happened years ago and it doesn't really affect me, but it can affect you if maybe these looted objects at the end maybe end up here in Switzerland. So this is some work that we're really doing. So we are engaging with involved circles. This is we talk with museums, we talk with the art trade, also with interested parties, etc. So this is a lot of work, and there is still, I mean, maybe what I could say is it is still an issue, it's still a challenge, but we also see that it changed. Like for instance, in the last 20 years, you could say that awareness has risen. People are getting a bit more sensitive to the issue. We can also tell this maybe as an example that we have now in the last couple of years, we had many people, private people, third parties, museums, but also a lot of private people who come to us and want to talk about objects they have. Maybe they inherited them, maybe they collected them themselves or from their grandfathers or whoever. And they say, oh, I think I don't want to keep this. I think I want to give this back to the country of origin. Like it's kind of a, they are not, by law, they are not, they don't have to do it because these pieces they have maybe have been in the families for ages. But they want to do it on a voluntary basis. And this is something that we see more often. And this is also something that we see that there's a mindset maybe that is changing and that we are very welcome. So this is one maybe of the challenges. And maybe another challenge that Sophia has been mentioning is really the problem, lack maybe of infrastructure or documentation also in the source countries, which is very important from our perspective, because if we talk about reclaiming or re-asking objects back, maybe from a country where they have been looted, so it is the more documentation you have, the more archives you have, that because we are in a state, we live under a rule of law. So it's really to have good cases, so you really need documentation. So this is also something that we also try to, when I talked about the projects that we found, like projects that really have targets on archives and inventors is something very important, because it also on the long hand side is also are also tools for the countries to reclaim something that has been looted, like during crisis, for instance. So there are many more challenges, but I think maybe for the time's sake, here come.
Yes, thank you, Tania, for sharing your insights. Also, again, to Lisa and Peter, thank you so much for sharing about your work, about the coordination, and also about the challenges that you are facing. Thank you so much to the audience for being here. I want to thank especially the people who joined online, also from the ground. Thank you for making the time and joining this panel and bringing in your perspective. And of course, a very big thank you to you three and also Hadi in absence. But thank you so much for being here and for sharing with us your insights and your rich experience in preservation of cultural heritage in turbulent times. Thank you so much, and